Every December, Boston puts up a Christmas tree on the Common, and every year it is a gift from a Canadian province, 2 provinces, and 1 border away. It has arrived almost every winter since 1971, and the original reason for it is a morning in 1917 when a city was flattened by the largest explosion humans had ever produced. This is Quilled history, the stories the textbooks quietly left out. So what actually happened in Halifax Harbor that morning? And how does a collision at walking pace destroy a city? What did one telegraph operator do in the 90 seconds he had left? And why did the response come from a foreign city 600 kilometers away before it came from anywhere closer? Halifax in 1917 was one of the busiest ports in the world because it was the assembly point for the convoys crossing to Europe. Ships loaded with munitions came up the eastern seaboard, gathered in the sheltered basin above the city, and sailed east in groups. The harbor was crowded, the traffic was constant, and everything about the operation was urgent. On the 6th of December, a French freighter was waiting to enter the basin. She had loaded in New York, and her cargo was almost entirely high explosive, over 2,000 tons of picric acid, a couple of 100 tons of TNT, 60 tons of gun cotton, and on the open deck, stacked in drums, several hundred barrels of highly volatile fuel. She carried no warning flag. Flying the red flag that signals explosives would have identified her instantly to any submarine in the approaches, so wartime practice was to say nothing, which meant that almost nobody in Halifax, including most of the people who would die that morning, had any idea what was sitting in their harbor. Coming the other way, out of the basin, was a Norwegian ship chartered to carry relief supplies to Belgium. She was running late, she was empty and riding high, and she entered the narrow channel on the wrong side of it, having agreed to pass an earlier vessel in a way that left her out of position. What follows is a sequence of whistle signals, each one intended to prevent a collision, that between them arranged one. Both captains signaled their intentions. Both misread the other's reply. Both ordered engines reversed at the last moment, and the reversal on one of them swung her bow directly into the side of the other. The impact was slow. In collision terms, it was almost gentle, a glancing strike that opened a gash in the hull. But it also ruptured the fuel drums on deck and threw sparks, and the fuel caught immediately. Within a minute, the forward part of the ship was burning with thick black smoke, and the crew understood exactly what was underneath it. They abandoned ship. They rowed for the far shore shouting warnings in French to people who did not speak it, and they were right to run, and they were unable to make anybody understand why. The burning freighter, with nobody aboard, drifted slowly across the harbor and grounded against a pier on the Halifax side, in the middle of a residential district. And then the worst thing happened, which is that it made a spectacle. A large ship on fire in the harbor was worth watching. People came out into the streets. Dock workers went toward it. Children on their way to school stopped. And thousands of people in the surrounding houses went to their windows and looked out through the glass. In the railway telegraph office, a dispatcher named Vince Coleman was told what the ship was carrying and left the building with a colleague. Then he remembered that a passenger train from St. John, carrying around 300 people, was due into Halifax within minutes and would run straight past that pier. He went back. He sat down at the quay and sent a message that survives in the records. "Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor, making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys." The train was stopped outside the city. He was still at the desk when it went. At 4 minutes and 35 seconds past 9, the cargo detonated. It was, by a wide margin, the largest explosion human beings had ever made, equivalent to roughly 3,000 tons of TNT, and it would not be exceeded until the first nuclear weapons 28 years later. The ship was vaporized. Fragments were thrown for kilometers. The half-ton shank of her anchor came down almost 4 kilometers away on the far side of the peninsula, and a gun barrel landed more than 5 kilometers off. The blast wave flattened everything within a 2-kilometer radius and was felt hundreds of kilometers away. Then the water. The explosion displaced the harbor so violently that a wave rose up the shorelines, reaching as high as 18 meters above the tide line on the Dartmouth side. It swept away the Mi'kmaq community at Turtle Grove entirely, a settlement that had been there for generations and was never rebuilt. Around 1,800 people were killed, 9,000 were injured, 1,600 buildings were destroyed outright and 12,000 damaged, and 25,000 people, in a city of about 50,000, were left without adequate shelter in December. And then a particular kind of injury that came directly from the fire being interesting. Thousands of people had been standing at their windows when the blast blew the glass inward. Around 6,000 suffered eye injuries, some 250 lost an eye, and around 41 were left permanently and completely blind. The following morning, it began to snow, and it did not stop. 40 centimeters fell in a blizzard, on a city with no roofs, no windows, no heat, and thousands of people trapped in the wreckage of their own houses. Rescue parties dug through drifted snow to reach people who had survived the explosion and then frozen. Halifax did not sit still waiting, and it deserves saying. Soldiers and sailors from the ships and barracks were pulling people out within minutes. Surviving doctors operated in whatever building still had a roof. Ordinary residents dug their neighbors out with bare hands. The city rescued most of its own survivors before any outside help could physically arrive. Word reached Boston that evening. And this is where the story turns, because Massachusetts did not wait to be asked, did not wait for a formal request through diplomatic channels, and did not wait for morning. The State Relief Committee was convened within hours, and a train was loaded that night. It left Boston before midnight with doctors, nurses, surgical supplies and equipment aboard, and it took 30 hours to get there, fighting through the same blizzard that had stopped everything else. It reached Halifax in the early hours of the 8th, and the medical teams were working before the day was out. More followed. Massachusetts sent further trains and ships, raised substantial funds, and its committee stayed involved in the reconstruction long after the emergency ended. The specific thing Halifax remembered was not the money. It was that Boston moved first, at night, in a blizzard, without being asked, for a city in another country. The following Christmas, in 1918, Halifax sent a tree to Boston as a thank you. It was a one-off gesture, gratefully received, and then, as these things do, it was quietly forgotten by almost everyone for the next 50 years. It came back by accident. In 1971, a Nova Scotia Christmas Tree Growers Association revived the idea, largely as a way of advertising their trees. Somebody then remembered why it had been done in the first place, and the province adopted it officially in 1976 as an annual gift, sent every year in memory of 1917. It is not casual now. The tree is selected months ahead against real criteria: species, height between 12 and 15 meters, symmetry, health. The family whose land it grows on is honored at the cutting. It is trucked south with a send-off, and it is lit on Boston Common at a ceremony that is broadcast every year. There is a harder afterword to this story. When American scientists were working out what an atomic bomb would do to a city, they had no data on explosions at that scale, because there had never been one. Except that there had. Halifax was the reference case, and the survey of its damage was studied for exactly that purpose. The city itself rebuilt. One district was reconstructed in fire-resistant concrete block with garden courtyards, on principles that were advanced for the time, and it is still standing and still lived in. The Relief Commission set up afterwards paid pensions to survivors and their dependents, and it did not wind up until 1976. Nobody was ever really held to account. The courts went back and forth, and the final ruling in 1920 found both ships equally at fault, which is legally tidy and satisfies nobody. The captains, the pilots, and the wartime system that put an unmarked munitions ship into a crowded civilian harbor all carried a share of it. So the tree on Boston Common is not a decoration, and it is not a marketing exercise, whatever restarted it. It is a receipt. It says that in December 1917 a city was destroyed in 9 seconds, and the first help through the door came from strangers in another country who left that night without being asked. They have been sending it for over 50 consecutive years now, for something that happened over a century ago, to thank people who are all long dead, on behalf of people who are also long dead. It is one of the longest-running thank yous in the world, and nobody involved has ever suggested it might be time to stop. History keeps better stories than the syllabus. Subscribe. Next up, our next video.